Good evening. You're going to be really glad you came tonight. We have a special speaker for you tonight that has been a great help to me. Mike Hale and his wife, Karen. I knew that. Yeah. They've been here for about a year, and I eventually found out that Michael's a lot smarter than I am. And last week, at the end of the sermon on Job, I mentioned it a little bit. I had talked about Leviathan and Behemoth, and he's going to kind of straighten that out so you'll really understand it. But you're also going to learn a lot of other things about creation, and it's just going to be a night that you'll be really glad you're here. You're going to learn some wonderful things. And so, Michael, come and teach us. I'm looking forward to it very much.
Most of what I'm going to do tonight is going to be on the screen, so if you're unhappy with your view, you're welcome to move if you want to. So you have my permission. Pastor Carl, over the last number of months, has been feeding us richly through the book of Job, and he's labored, and we've benefited, and now he gives me the opportunity to do the encore. So that's what I'm doing tonight. I want to start by just giving a brief review again of what Job is all about. And then we'll get into the presentation with a focus on these two particular creatures that the Lord spent a chapter and a half out of 4 chapters. When the Lord speaks, as you know, 4 full chapters, he spends 1.5 chapters devoted to these 2 creatures. And so I want to give you some perspective on what I understand these creatures to be. I speak Hebrew with a Kentucky accent, so... We say Behemoth and Leviathan, and Hebrew says something like Behemoth and Leviathan. I've got a talking Hebrew dictionary, and so that's where that comes from. And actually, even Job is Eova. So we get them all wrong, so it doesn't matter what you say when you're speaking these words, because you're wrong, I'm wrong. So we just have to have grace for all of us. Now, in our study of Job, the first 2 chapters is where we were introduced to Job. And there's a remarkable thing that God says about Job. He says, there is no one on earth like him. Can you imagine God talking about all of humanity and actually saying there is no one on earth like you? Well, it's true that there is no one like you. But in the case of Job, he really stood out really for his character, his righteousness, his relationship with the Lord. But Satan enters in those first 2 chapters, and he actually says to the Lord, stretch out your hand and strike everything that Job has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And Satan had basically said the only reason that Job serves you is because of your blessings. And Job, we learn in the first 2 chapters, had a big, happy family. He was extraordinarily prosperous. He had a great business. He was highly respected in the community. You know, he had so much that was a blessing from God. And again, Satan says, take it away and he'll curse you. And what's surprising there is the Lord at that point says, you can have him. and there's 2 phases where initially Satan takes away, Job's family. That's tragedy. He takes away his business and his prosperity. And he afflicts him physically, and Job loses his reputation. People, instead of praising him, began to think this man is surely cursed by God. That's really the attitude of the people. And so we're introduced to Job, and then we go into chapters 3 through 31, and we have these 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and they come together in principle to console and comfort him, but it really doesn't work out that way. They end up debating the reasons for Job's afflictions and the nature of God's dealing with mankind. And his friends accuse him of being self-righteous and of hiding secret sins. They assume that the only possible reason to explain all the tragedy that's come into Job's life has to be he has sinned and he has become an enemy of God. So all of his friends now, again, are looking at him as if he is a great sinner and nobody seems to know what it is he's done. And Job doesn't either. And so we see in the course of their discussion some of the pleas that come from Job's heart. And a couple of them I picked out. Here he says, "But I desire to speak to the Almighty, to argue my case with God. How many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offense and my sin. Why do you hide your face and consider me your enemy?" So we see from this that Job is extremely confused. You know, he has gone from this great place of blessing and worshiping God and seeking to do everything that he believes is right to having his world fall in on him. And so he's confused and he's not hearing from God. You know, that's one of the most difficult things is when you're in a difficult place and you feel like you're not hearing from God. And that's exactly where Job was. And then we have this again later on. "Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing." So throughout all of these chapters, 3 through 31, while this discussion is going on, Job is pleading with God to show him what possibly could he have done. He was not aware of having done anything to offend God. His friends were saying, "You have offended God." And so it was a very confusing time, lots of turmoil and stress in his life. But also along the way, we see some tremendous prophetic insights. These two verses really stood out. "Even now my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. My intercessor is my friend as my eyes pour out tears to God. On behalf of a man, he pleads with God as one pleads for a friend." That's quite remarkable. What's the name of the advocate? If you go to 1 John, we get the name of the advocate. We're told that Jesus is our advocate. Even when we sin, Jesus is our advocate. And so in his heart, he knew he had an advocate, but he didn't know the name at that point. And then we have this other insight. "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. How my heart yearns within me." So again, in the midst of all of his suffering, his pain, all of this turmoil in his life, yet he still had something deep within him. And I think sometimes when you go through trouble, you're probably in a similar situation. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of internal, maybe, stress. But you know, if you are a believer, that your Redeemer lives. And here we get the insight that, of course, we do have a Redeemer, and his name, again, is Jesus. We know his name. We know that he shall stand on the earth. It's going to happen maybe sooner than later. And he also speaks about resurrection, which is one of the few, but one of the Old Testament references to the fact that resurrection is a reality. So we have these great insights that come. Now, as we move into the next few chapters, 32 through 37, we now have Elihu, who comes. He's the youngest of those who are present, and he's withheld his counsel, but he steps in and he proclaims God's justice. He condemns human self-righteousness, and he prepares the way for the Lord to then speak. And that's what then, of course, happens now in chapters 38 through 41, which is where we'll spend our time. So when the Lord speaks, he begins by asking this question: "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words?" Now, that's not what I want to hear God say to me. But I think in reality, God could probably say that to every one of us. I mean, I have questioned God, and I think I'm in good company when it comes to that. Thankfully, he doesn't reject us. He didn't reject Job. And interestingly, what Job did not know, if you actually go to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14, twice in that chapter, the Lord is speaking to Ezekiel, and he names 3 people who were standouts for their righteousness. And I don't know if you were picking Old Testament characters, who you would pick, but the Lord picked out Noah, Job, and Daniel. So twice in Ezekiel 14, God declares that these are examples of righteousness. And so Job is one of those. And so again, it says that there was no one like him on earth. And he hit bottom. So Sometimes, again, we're going to experience difficulties, but it's good to know that even though you go through a difficulty, that does not mean God's rejected you, but there are trials, there are tests that come. So God says, "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you." Now, what if God said that to you? I've got some questions now I need you to answer. God then begins asking questions which are rhetorical, meaning he knows that Job's not able to answer these, but these are questions that provide insight. And so God speaks about his creation, kind of a surprise after all of this dialogue about suffering and pain and righteousness, that God talks about his creation. And then he begins to talk about animals. He begins to name and discuss animals that have been created and their various attributes. But then he directs Job's attention to these two creatures, Behemoth, which he says, "I made along with you." His tail sways like a cedar. He ranks first among the works of God. And we're going to look at some other attributes that are describing Behemoth. And we have Leviathan. And likewise, God has an entire chapter devoted to this particular creature. So obviously, if God's going to spend so much time, we might want to think about what could he possibly be talking about here? What are these creatures that he's speaking about? So I'm going to be playing video clips as we go through the talk. So I'll be going back and forth between slides and some video. So now, hopefully, if the sound's good, we're going to hear some video.
Job chapter 40 describes a majestic creature using the name Behemoth, which means colossal beast. In context, Job and his philosopher friends just finished over 30 chapters of dialogue trying to explain God and why he would allow such hardships into Job's life. Then God shows up in a whirlwind, tells Job to brace himself like a man, and says that he would be the one asking Job the questions for a while. Then, for 4 chapters straight, God asks Job 77 rhetorical questions that all have to do with creation. After explaining to Job that he's the master designer of space and earth, God describes 13 of his created animals, such as an ostrich, horse, and deer, then caps off the discussion by telling Job about his 2 grandest creations, Behemoth and Leviathan. God calls Behemoth the first of all his ways, meaning the first in rank, the chief, the most supreme of his creative works. In context, God is saying to Job, "Sit down, brace yourself, and now I will tell you of the chief of all my works, the biggest, most amazing land creature I ever made." When we scan through all land-dwelling creatures, both living and extinct, which one comes up as the first in rank, the most colossal, or the chief? Clearly the sauropod dinosaur. Pairing God's word that Behemoth is the grandest creature he ever made with the fact that sauropods are the largest land creatures we've ever found should give us a clue to Behemoth's identity. Sauropods were huge. The largest one found to date was over 120 feet long. That's 10 freeway lanes across. At a weight of 76 tons, it's a wonder these creatures could even walk.
So we're given a half a chapter of description of Behemoth. And I've highlighted a few of the things that are in this chapter. Again, God says that I made him along with you. Now, a lot of Bible commentators, when they look at Behemoth, they either say, well, it's a hippopotamus, or it's an elephant, or it's a mythical creature. Those are typically what commentators will say. But again, God says, I made him along with you. And then he goes on to describe its tail as like a cedar tree. And he gives other things, other comments about who he is. The mountains offered its food, so it goes up into the highlands, but it also likes to play and be in the streams. It's an herbivore, and it's not disturbed even by a raging river. And no human is able to catch it off guard or put a ring in its nose or lead it away. So when you think about, again, these various animals, if you look at all the descriptors, every one of them matches a sauropod, which is, again, the largest land animal that's ever been known. But when you look at the hippopotamus and the elephant, it's very questionable that those would satisfy the criteria. And one of the reasons that our Bible commentators use Behemoth and Leviathan, these are transliterated Hebrew words. And the reason they do that is they don't know what they are. So they basically say, well, Hebrew says Behemoth, so I can't say elephant. Actually, my Amplified Bible puts hippopotamus, in brackets. But typically they simply put the Hebrew word in because they don't know what it is. So again, I think the best fit of all animals that have ever lived is the sauropod. And again, neither the hippo or the elephant work. Now, cedar tree, its tail is like a cedar tree. In ancient Israel, amongst the trees, the cedar was a standout in terms of its grandeur. You read in the Bible about the cedars of Lebanon. There's not a lot of big trees in the land of Israel. I've been there. Not a lot of big trees, but in Lebanon, there were certainly large cedars. So would you think that this would be a good description of, say, an elephant tail or a hippo tail? If you were asked to describe the tail, would you say, well, their tails are like a cedar tree? I don't think it's a good fit. On the other hand, the sauropod comes pretty close to that. Okay? Now, interesting, while most Bible commentators, and I have quite a few commentaries, will say it's, again, mythical or a hippo or an elephant, one of the Bibles that I have is a graphic novel Bible. You could say written for children and written for people who like pictures. A lot of these are used in prisons where people struggle with their literacy. And so they have the entire Bible in 3 volumes. And so here they actually show a sauropod. And they show a creature that perhaps would be, in somebody's imagination, closer to the Leviathan. We'll get to that in time. So there are a few commentators that have a different view. Why are dinosaurs important? Well, how we view dinosaurs is related to how we understand God's word and God's character. So, did God use a long, slow, clumsy, random, murderous process in order to develop life on earth through random mutations and survival of the fittest, sometimes described as red in tooth and claw? Or did God create everything very good, lovingly give humans a free choice, and then we, that is our ancestors, mess things up? Well, clearly the second is the view that's presented in Scripture. And we'll look at a few more scriptures on that. To start with Genesis chapter 1. I know you've all read it many times. When you get to the 6th day, it says that God made the land animals. Okay, and on the 6th day, at the culmination, he made humans. Now, a little quiz. Do you know what a year is? A year is the amount of time it takes for the earth to go in a circuit around the sun, right? You know what a month, that is a month, is? Right, the time it takes the moon to go around the earth. And you all know what a day is, the time it takes the earth to revolve, one complete revolution. So what then is a week? There's no astronomical basis for a week. All these other units of time, there's an astronomical basis. The week is Genesis chapter 1. That's what the week is. And God could have done anything. He could have created all things in a microsecond. He could have created all things in billions of years because he's almighty, he's all powerful. But he tells us he chose to create in 6 days and rest on the 7th in order to establish the week as a unit of time by which humans would order their lives. And guess what? Here we are, and this is Wednesday, and we are ordering our lives according to a 7-day week. And all over the earth, they're doing that. Again, there is no astronomical basis whatsoever. It's purely Genesis 1 and 2 if you carry over. Now, when you go to the 10 Commandments, it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Now, if you lived at the time of Moses, would you perhaps have interpreted that to mean, well, God took 1,000,000 years for one day and 1,000,000 years for 2 ways, and each day represents millions of years or eons of time? How would the audience have understood this? Pretty straightforward, right? They would have said, oh yeah, I know what a day is. I live that. I go to bed, I get up, I work, play, I go to bed. I understand what a day is. And And here it says that he created in 6 days, he rested on the seventh, and he gave them a Sabbath rest. That's reaffirmed elsewhere by Moses, or the Lord, I should say, in Exodus 31, telling them that they have to observe the Sabbath. 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. On the seventh day he abstained from work and he rested. Now, as we move forward in Scripture, consider this. Jesus affirmed a literal understanding of Genesis. So Jesus said at the beginning of creation, not billions of years after creation, from the beginning of creation, he made male and female. And he repeated that later. Haven't you read that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? Again, not billions of years later, but at the beginning. And then he reaffirmed the veracity of Noah in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. So Jesus clearly understood and taught Genesis as literal history. Well, what about the apostles? Same thing. We've got a variety of places where Paul talks about Adam. It's very central in our faith. And he says Adam was formed first, then Eve. Hebrews, the author there, talks about Noah building the ark. Jude talks about Enoch, the seventh from Adam. That's Genesis chapter 5, where it gives the chronogenealogies of the various people there. So he's reaffirming that truth. Peter, both in 1 Peter and 2 Peter, affirms Noah. So all the apostles clearly taught and believed in a literal understanding of the book of Genesis. And so, obviously, the world around us teaches that we came into our existence through a long evolutionary process of 14 to 15 billion years, and death and disease have been a part from the very beginning. Death is actually a mechanism by which life advances. And basically all the world's religions teach that death and suffering is a part of life, that it's a part of the original creation order. The Bible is unique in that it says that God originally created all things very good. He gave humans a free choice. They freely chose to go away from God, and as a result of that, they experienced a curse. And death came about as a result of sin. And sin is an enemy. And you can go and read in Romans 5 and other places in Romans, Galatians, and other that go into great depth talking about these things, saying that, again, sin is an enemy, and one day sin will be no more, in terms of the new heavens and the new earth. That's where we're headed. So the biblical timeline for the dinosaur is created on day 6. And I will mention, technically, a dinosaur is a land-dwelling creature. If they're flying in the air, a pterodactyl, that's not classified as a dinosaur. And if they're swimming in the sea, a plesiosaur, then not technically a dinosaur, but broadly speaking, we can refer to them as dinosaurs. So the Jewish people, the rabbis actually teach that the Leviathan was created on day 5 because it was a sea creature. That's just a little tidbit. You can forget that if you want. Creation scientists believe that in totality, there were probably less than 85 different kinds of dinosaur creatures. So even though there may be a variety of sauropods, if you think of sauropod perhaps as a created kind, just like we would say of dogs today, whether it's a domesticated dog with 200 plus varieties, or whether it's a wolf or a dingo, it's one created kind biblically. And so there's less than 85 different created kinds. And so obviously when the flood came, when you go to Genesis, God told Noah to bring 2 of every kind of the land-dwelling animals into the ark. So there would have been dinosaurs to go onto the ark. Now, dinosaurs lay eggs, and the largest dinosaur eggs that have ever been found are something like the size of a bowling ball, which means dinosaurs start small. So even if one might end up like a sauropod as much as 120 feet in length, it didn't start that way. And so certainly God would have brought smaller creatures, younger creatures to the ark. There would have been no need to have a large creature on the ark. Okay, so obviously the flood came, the animals were released. After the flood, it appears that the environmental conditions were not as conducive for dinosaur kind of life as before. They would have lived and they would have continued at least through the days of Job and beyond. I think you'll see in a minute. But basically, it was difficult for them to compete with other life forms, and it appears that humans hunted them so that eventually they became, we think, extinct today. There's no evidence that there's a living dinosaur today. I hope someday that somebody finds one, but there is no evidence of that. And so again, this one creature appears to fit the bill better than anything else that we know. Now, is there any evidence that dinosaurs didn't go extinct 65 million years ago? What the secular scientists will say that somewhere between 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs became extinct. The age of the dinosaurs may have been from like 250 million years ago up to that 65 million years ago. But is there possible evidence? If the Bible is true, then dinosaurs lived more recently than that, right? Is there any possible evidence for that? Well, let me show you a few things. This is a pictograph in Peru, said to be over 3,000 years old. And this shows hunters gathered around an animal. Now, I do not think that's a llama. To start with, it's much too big and its tail is way too long. And actually, the local person who kind of oversees this talks about this will say off camera that he thinks it's a dinosaur too, but he will not say it on camera. This is actually filigree or a brass plating around the tomb of Bishop Richard Bell from the year 1496. That's when he died. And what you can see amongst a variety of known animals that are engraved, you have this engraving. It's a little hard to hear, but it looks very much like two sauropod type dinosaurs intertwined, either mating or fighting. It's hard to tell. So this, if you notice the rear end of this, if you can see it, where it looks kind of like knobby. Interestingly, this particular dinosaur was not discovered a fossil form until 1977 in China. And notice that its tail looks surprisingly similar to one that's here. There are temples, as you know, in Cambodia. These temples were dated to about the year 1200 AD. And at one of these temples in Ta Phram, there is this engraving. And this looks remarkably like a stegosaur. Now, people who would not accept that this is a stegosaur says this is probably just an ordinary animal, and these are flowers draped around its back. I think stegosaur maybe fits the description a little bit better. Here's a footprint from Texas. This is in a museum in Texas, and it actually appears to be that of and it's actually right outside of Dinosaur National Park in Texas. It appears to be the imprint of a dinosaur foot over a human foot. In Alaska, there's actually a bone bed in northern Alaska, which it turns out these dinosaur bones, and they're duck-billed dinosaurs, are not fossilized. When these were first found, it was assumed they were some animals like caribou or something like that because they're not fossilized. But after looking at it more closely, we see that they're actually all duck-billed dinosaur bones, and they, again, are not fossilized at all. And that's kind of embarrassing and hard to explain for some. What you will not see in a museum is that found buried with dinosaur bones around the world are all of these animals have been found buried in the same bone bed with dinosaurs. And if you consider that, how about parrots and owls and penguins and ducks and loons? This whole talk about, well, dinosaurs are among us today, they're the birds. Well, actually the birds were living along with the dinosaurs when these were buried. All of these creatures have been found. There are museums like the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh that actually says that you wouldn't find these kinds of things, nor would you find any soft tissue, which we're going to look at in just a moment. But again, it would be interesting to go to museums and see all of these creatures together on one display, but you won't find that. So soft tissue, this is something that's, I think, really quite remarkable. Would you expect to find soft tissue in bones that are 70 or 200 or 300 million years old? No, you wouldn't. And nobody looked for years and years because they knew it could not be present. Let's look at this a little bit. We're going to watch another short video clip. Dr. Mary Schweitzer from North Carolina State had been doing some work with T-Rex bones from out west, I think from Wyoming, and she discovered soft tissue. And when she published that work in 2005, well, it took a while to get published. She couldn't get it through the review process for a long time. But eventually, it did get reviewed and published, and it's still controversial. But let's listen to this clip.
And in these cross-sections of fossilized bone, she saw something that she and everyone else had thought was impossible. Round structures that looked like red blood cells. Dinosaur blood cells.
Inside those channels where the blood vessels would have run were these little round red structures that were all kind of lined up like a train, and they were bright red and translucent. Nobody else had seen anything like that before.
The very idea of blood cells in a 70-million-year-old bone was more than unconventional. It was radical.
Nobody was imagining that dinosaurs might have had preserved soft tissues.
Derek Briggs is curator of invertebrate paleontology at the Peabody Museum at Yale University. So along comes Mary Schweitzer, and she's starting to look inside dinosaur bones and has made this startling discovery about the presence of red blood cells. What was your initial reaction to that?
Oh, I think the same reaction as everybody's, that this was totally improbable. She perhaps misinterpreted the evidence or was exaggerating the potential for what she was seeing.
So skeptical at first.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Why do you think it didn't occur to anybody?
Because we have this clear understanding that part of all biological cycles involves decay. I mean, nature is set up to break down that material and recycle it. So it's just improbable that those kinds of very delicate structures would survive, particularly for millions of years.
When you think about it, the laws of chemistry and biology and everything else that we know say that it should be gone. It should be degraded completely. This is not possible. Do it again. We got another piece of bone. We put it in the solution. We waited 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. Looked again. More blood vessels. We must have repeated that with probably 17 or 18 different fragments of bone.
I had another nice video clip that I skipped over in light of time that talks about this some more, but take a look at this. She says, if you take a blood sample and you stick it on a shelf, you'll have nothing recognizable in about a week. So why would there be anything left in dinosaurs? When publishing her results, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible. She wrote back asking, well, what type of data would convince you? And the reviewer replied, none. That's why it's hard to get some things published. Took her a long time to get her work published in Science. And again, what bothers people, why is it there? A lot of people aren't willing to accept the data until we come up with a mechanism for preservation. Hear what that's saying? They will not accept the data that there is soft tissue present until they can explain how it could be there for 70 million years. Will not accept the data until they come up with an explanation of preservation. Okay, so it's hitting them in the face and they're rejecting the obvious. It's not 70 million years old. So she says, here's what we see, and this is what we've done. Here's our results. And another comment that she made, when they are actually digging up these bones at Hell Creek, again, it's either Montana or Wyoming, they say that there's the smell of death in the bones. Now, if these are all fossilized and they're all minerals, why would you even have the smell of death present as they are unearthing the bones? And obviously, it's because there's still tissue that's present. There have now been about 120 peer-reviewed articles published, and I've got a list of many of those, but I won't show you that, where soft tissues have been found, including DNA, in some cases, intact DNA. Not the complete strands, but broken pieces of DNA. All kinds of different proteins, different kinds of tissues of many sorts have now been discovered. For many years, people didn't look. They knew it wasn't there, so why bother looking? Now that they're looking, they're finding it. So moving on to Leviathan, okay? Again, we're not going to go through all this because we're going to actually work through the chapter in just a minute, but God spends an entire chapter giving us a lot of detail about this creature. If it's mythical, which many commentators say, why would God bother to give us an entire chapter of detailed information about this creature? Now, what people see about this creature that causes them to think it's mythical, one of them, it talks about fire breathing. And people say, well, that's clearly in the realm of myth, so obviously this is a mythical creature they're talking about. But that's not the way God describes this. He describes this as real, something that Job was familiar with. Again, he's pointing out to Job, you've seen Behemoth, you've seen Leviathan, and he's giving these descriptions, okay? Candidates for Leviathan. Where with Behemoth, there's a fairly strong consensus that a sauropod is what God had in mind there. With the Leviathan, there's more debate. So I'll give you two of the creatures that are being discussed, but it may not be either of these. But it is something that's real that Job knew of. So one is a Spinosaurus. I wouldn't want to meet one of those. How about you? Doesn't look very friendly. Here he's swimming. He was known to be a swimmer. This particular creature, it talks about being out even in the open seas. So these are different renditions of the Spinosaurus. Another creature, which we'll go into a little bit more, is the Deinosuchus. Now, this creature is in the crocodilian family, but at maturity, these creatures were in the neighborhood of 35 feet long and weighed 8,000 pounds. So a modern American alligator at maturity might be 800 pounds. So imagine an 8,000 pound crocodile or alligator. You wouldn't want to meet that one either. Here's another view of him. Scutes are the hard shell that's like on the top of an alligator or crocodile. I'm sure most of you have handled a small, right, crocodile or alligator, very hard on the top. In the case of the Deinosuchus, these are 3 inches thick. Okay, so when it talks about it being impenetrable, when the Lord is speaking to Job and talking about the harpoon, the arrow, can't penetrate it, well, imagine a 3-inch thick, hard scale around it. That would be something you wouldn't want to take on. So this is a cast of the Deinosuchus head.
Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line, which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me, that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light. and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him, and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride.
So if Leviathan is a creature of fantasy, why would God use an imaginary creature to demonstrate his power as creator? Why would he say, you should fear me because I made him, if Leviathan is imaginary? Especially after reviewing all of these known living animals. Now, again, what's most surprising about this creature, and there's a lot that is surprising, is this smoke and fire. Now, the reason I put this in here, I think this is quite surprising too. An electric eel, there's at least 3 different species, and one of them can produce 860 volts of electricity. I think that's surprising. Even something as simple as the firefly or lightning bug, bioluminescence, to me that's surprising also. But it's there, obviously, we see these things. And consider, some of you know about the bombardier beetle. If you don't, you're going to learn more about him right now.
Consider the bombardier beetle, which has a kind of bomb in its belly. The bombardier beetle doesn't have explosives tied to its back. It doesn't carry around a miniature stick of dynamite. Its insides are not full of nitroglycerin. No, this little bug has tiny glands inside its body that produce 2 harmless chemicals, known as hydroquinones and the more familiar hydrogen peroxide. The bombardier beetle secretes these chemicals into a kind of holding area or storage tank. Then, if the beetle senses danger and is agitated by an attacker, it quickly moves the chemicals from its storage tank into yet another chamber, which could be called the explosion chamber. The beetle secretes special catalyst enzymes into the once harmless chemical mixture, making a toxic spray that reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, or 100 degrees Celsius. That's right, the temperature at which water boils. So amazing and effective is this bomb-making abilities of the bombardier beetle that scientists have sought for several years to learn all they can from its intricate design features. In fact, researchers admit that understanding this beetle better could lead to significant advances in combustion research. Amazingly, when the bombardier beetle bombs away, it doesn't blow up. It doesn't develop a high fever and die. The noxious spray doesn't eat through the chamber walls and kill the beetle. No, the beetle sizes up its attacker and quickly rotates 2 rear nozzles at the end of the explosion chamber so that they point in the precise direction of the attacker. The bombardier beetle then fires the boiling hot mixture toward the enemy with pinpoint accuracy in a high-speed, rapid-fire, machine gun-like fashion at about 500 rounds or pulses of toxic spray per second. Years ago, Time magazine described the defense system of the bombardier beetle as extraordinarily intricate. Across cross between tear gas and a Tommy gun. They noted how the special fluid of the beetle is pumped through twin rear nozzles, which can be rotated like a B-17's gun turret to hit a hungry ant or frog with bullseye accuracy. A few years later, Science magazine published an article by Jeffrey Dean and his colleagues who highlighted the fact that the ejection system of the beetle shows basic similarity to the pulse jet propulsion mechanism of the German V-1 buzz bomb of World War II. Evolutionists allege that this amazing insect is the product of millions of years of evolution. Can you imagine the evolution, really, of the bombardier beetle? If this theory were true, then there had to have been a time when the bombardier beetle did not produce a toxic spray. There had to have been a time when it did not store a 212-degree mixture. There had to have been a time when it had never shot anything out of its back end as hot as boiling water. If so, what would have happened the first time the beetle somehow mixed a boiling hot solution without already having a storage tank in place that could withstand such temperatures? What would have happened the first time this beetle ever blew a bomb out of its back end? Why did the beetle not blow up the first time it ever created a bomb? Do you really think that the bombardier beetle just evolved by chance over millions of years? Or does common sense not call for a creator who made this incredible insect with all of its necessary parts in place at the same time at creation?
An interesting thing about the Deinosuchus is that it has an enlarged chamber at the tip of its snout, and it has two sets of nostrils. One set that are on top are clearly there for breathing. The second set is aimed forward, and at this point, no one understands what possibly the reason for those nostrils is. So again, there's a speculation that possibly these other two nostrils are connected to a chamber in which some kind of fire-breathing ability existed. Now, in the video earlier, it talked about pyrophoric chemicals, which are those that spontaneously ignite when made out in presence of oxygen. And that's a possibility, but another possibility could well be, as we all know, that there are bacteria that are present in a lot of animals that produce methane, like cows. Have you ever heard about cows and methane? And do you know another name for methane? It's natural gas, right? Natural gas is almost pure methane. Some bacteria actually produce hydrogen. So another speculative idea is that, within this creature, there was the ability to produce either methane or hydrogen, then they just simply needed some kind of a catalytic spark in order for it to be ignited. So this is clearly in the realm of speculation, but in light of the amazing capabilities of some of the creatures that we already know about today, it's not a big leap at all to think that there was some animal in the past that had the ability to produce a flame. Now, the next place we're going to go to, is there a potential connection between dinosaurs and dragons? Okay.
One creature remembered in the legends of almost every human culture that's ever existed. A creature depicted with remarkable similarity by the Chinese, the Aztecs, even the Inuit, who live in a frozen land where no reptiles are found. Even they have stories of this animal, the dragon. Cultures from different continents, people who had no contact with one another, yet all of them have stories describing the same mythical animal. Could it be these stories were more than myth? What if we discovered that this creature that haunts our imagination had once been real?
So the King James Version, most of you are familiar with that translation. Many of you have read it. It was produced in the year 1611. And 22 times in the Old Testament and 13 times in the New Testament, it uses the word dragon. Okay? A few examples are just here. In Isaiah, he links actually Leviathan, a fleeing serpent, and a dragon all in one verse. And then you can see the dragon well near Jerusalem. And then, of course, we're all familiar with Revelation 12, the red dragon. So Richard Owen, who was a British paleontologist, invented the word dinosaur in the year 1841. So is there any reason to think that translators in the year 1611 would have talked about dinosaurs? The word never existed until, again, 1841. So throughout our history in the past, there are lots and lots of references to dragons. And dragons both refer to land and sea creatures, typically a kind of a reptile, often very large. So what's some potential evidence of dragons? A few commentaries here from Science Digest. Dragon legends have been with humanity since the dawn of recorded history. The dragon slaying theme was an important motif in the Sumerian mythology of the 3rd century BC. Evolutionist and life science writer Kerr Thans admits that dragons are found in the myths and the legends of cultures all around the world. And then this quote, I think, is quite germane. The flood is not the only common remembrance of the world's cultures. And if you've studied this, there are about 250 legends from various people groups from around the world, ranging from the Cherokees and the Aztecs to the Aborigines of Australia through the Middle East, stories of a worldwide global flood. That's a separate topic. But throughout the earth, cultures talk about a time when the earth was flooded. And of course, we have Genesis chapter 6 through 9 that describe the flood of Noah's day. Well, dragon legends are actually even more common than flood legends. There are many hundreds upon hundreds of dragon legends, and they are found all over the earth, from England to China, from India, South America, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, just all over, Japan. There are legends of various types that talk about, again, this broad category of creatures which we refer to as dragons. When you look in Scripture, it seems very likely, going back to Genesis 10, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it was said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Some have speculated, and I think it makes sense, that as there was the proliferation of land animals and people across the earth following the flood and the Tower of Babel, that people were afraid of some of the wild beasts. And one way to gain notoriety and fame was to actually slay beasts. It was a way to elevate, your status, to be a protector of the people, a protector of the village. And you find that in the stories like of Europe as well, the slaying of dragons. So it would seem that even Nimrod was one who battled against animals. Again, the Book of Encyclopedia, World Book, says that dragon legends are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on the earth. Dragons were generally evil and destructive, and every country had them in its mythology. Every country had them in its mythology. We actually have stories recorded. We'll look at a little bit of Marco Polo all the way down through Herodotus, Pliny the Elder, who actually describe various dragons that were observed in their day. So all of them have stories recorded. Here's pottery that comes again from Lima, Peru, of an animal that is not like anything that's alive today, but it fits the description of a dragon. This goes back again, to 1000 AD or earlier. You're all familiar with the Chinese zodiac animals. And interestingly, you got snake and horse and sheep and monkey and rooster and dog and pig and rat and ox and tiger and rabbit and dragon. So how many of those are real creatures? Is it all but one? Or is there some memory of there being something that they classified as a dragon in their history? Now, this is actually a fossil, and it looks interesting. Dracorex. Take a look at its head. Does that not fit the description of a lot of what you see depicted as a dragon? This is actually from the Song dynasty of around 1200 AD from China. Again, one of their drawings of a dragon. We have church historians, John of Damascus. He says that dragons exist, but they are reptiles born of other reptiles. When just born and young, they're small. But when they grow up and mature, they become big and fat so that they exceed other reptiles in length and size. It is said that they grow up to be more than 30 cubits or 45 feet. So in his day, going back to around the year 700, they certainly consider these as real creatures. Here's some tapestries from around the year 1550 from Europe, and it's a little hard to make out, but these are depictions of loading and disembarking from Noah's Ark. And they have all kinds of common animals that we would know, but along with all the common animals, they have dragons that are depicted in the tapestry. Here's another tapestry found in France. Again, you can see two different creatures, one of them over here on the left and one kind of hiding on the right. The one on the right looks like a baby duck-billed dinosaur. So there's a variety of tapestries still in castles today that go back hundreds of years where people routinely included these along with other animals in their drawings. Here's another church historian. He says, winged dragons, small, great, and the greatest have been produced at all times in every land. This comes from around the mid-1600s. And likewise, again, when you consider the various languages, basically all the languages across the earth have dragons in them. In the case of European languages, a lot of them sound similar, but then you have languages from Asia and South America, but they all describe this kind of a creature. So why would they all have in their histories, in their collective memories, something that is considered non-existent or simply mythical? Now, when it comes to unearthing dinosaur bones, that did not become a thing until the early 1800s. So we saw that the name dinosaur wasn't invented to 1841. It wasn't until the early 1800s that people began unearthing what we now refer to as fossils. They were simply referred to as dragons, dragon bones, or reptile bones, or unknown bones, or monster bones. So it wasn't like throughout time people have been digging up sauropod bones and making up stories about dragons. There's no record in history of this kind of thing happening. We'll quickly go through a few legends. In Babylon, the Ishtar Gate includes creatures that are reptilian and like, standing up firm on four legs. And again, a dinosaur is a reptile that stands upright. So reptiles, most of them, like a crocodile today, their legs go out kind of to the side, their belly rests on the ground. A dinosaur, the bones and the hip structures had to be such that they stood upright on their legs, okay? And depicted on the Ishtar Gate are creatures that look like dragons or dinosaurs. And that goes back to the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Australia, the Aborigines have stories of sea and lake monsters that look very much like a plesiosaur. In Great Britain, there's at least 81 different locations that range from Scotland in the north to Wales to Sussex that talk about in their history something to do with a dragon. In China, we already talked about their zodiac. If you look at actually the travels of Marco Polo, which you see happened in the 1200s, he described some of these long and lanky serpents which had short legs and claws. He claimed that the Chinese would use special methods to kill these dragons, and some of the dragon's body parts were then used for medicinal purposes, and others were eaten as a delicacy. So Marco Polo actually talked about dragons in his journey across the Middle East, India, and China. He wrote about them. In North Africa, interesting story, the Roman historian Cassius Dio recounted how the Roman army once killed a dragon. He says, one day when Regulus, a Roman consul, was fighting against Carthage in North Africa, a dragon suddenly crept up and settled behind the wall of the Roman army. The Romans killed it by order of Regulus. They skinned it and they sent the hide to the Roman Senate. When the dragon's hide, as Dio says, was measured by order of the Senate, it happened to be amazingly 120 feet long, and the thickness was fitting to its length. So this is a historian recording something that they said happened In Egypt, Herodotus, who is a Greek historian, talks about a serpent-like creature that looks like a water snake, but it has wings without feathers. And he actually said he saw the bones in a particular area of a lot of these creatures. He was taken and shown them. In Sweden, we have the story of Beowulf, a fiery flying serpent. I think you've all heard of the story, a little bit of Beowulf. It goes back to the 8th century. In Utah, in America, you have petroglyphs or etchings in stone that resemble air or land dragons. So let's take a look at a few of those. These may be a little hard for you to see, but top left, again, this is from around the year 1300. It looks very much like a sauropod. On the bottom left, it looks a whole lot like a fire-breathing dragon. And then you have up on the top right in Utah what appears to be a flying, pterodactyl kind of an animal. And in the bottom right, again, you have another. So all of these are many hundreds of years old that are drawings that have been left, on surfaces. It would appear that these people saw something, that they didn't just individually all make up these things, that they were actually depicting things that they themselves had seen. An interesting thing here is it was not until the 20th century, that's the 1900s, that dragons were seen as myths. In 1890, a large flying dragon was killed in Arizona. Samples were sent to universities back east. This was recorded in a newspaper. And so it's similar to, you've heard of the dodo bird. This was the flightless bird, I think, in the Pacific, and sailors used to stop at a particular island and harvest them for meat. We heard a lot about meat this weekend. Well, eventually there were no dodo birds, and it became considered to be a myth of the dodo. So for many years in Europe, they now said the whole dodo thing was a myth. But then eventually people went to those islands and began to unearth, and they found bones and remains, and they found that, no, that myth was real. The dodo was a real thing, but it became a myth, but now it's real again, though it is extinct. So having heard all of this, 1.5 chapters where God is talking about Behemoth and Leviathan, Job actually repents. So he was impacted by these things, and of course, just the message that God gave. And so as we kind of wrap up, what are some learnings, again, we take away from the book of Job? Not just about Behemoth and Leviathan and the fact that, these were real creatures that are now extinct, but they were real. But here's a commentary from Henry Morris, who was actually a creation scientist. He was actually the dean of engineering at, I think, University of Virginia at one point. Then he started Institute for Creation Research. He says, the pervasive theme of Job's book is the mystery of the suffering of the righteous in a world created by a righteous and omnipotent God. However, though this may be the theme of the book, this is not its purpose. For the book never answers that question. Even God, in his remarkable 4-chapter monologue at the end of the book, never mentions the question at all. Rather, God emphasizes the vital importance of the doctrine of special creation. And if you think about it, Genesis 1 begins with God introducing himself as the creator. And as you go through the Bible, in Revelation, God is again introducing himself over and over again as the creator. And of course, he is the creator of the new heavens and the new earth as well. But the majority of the books of the Bible, God speaks of himself as the creator, or people speak of God as the creator. So that's like foundational. So God emphasizes the special importance of the doctrine of special creation and the sovereign right of the creator to use and test his creatures as he wills. Now that can make us uncomfortable. But that's his point of emphasis, that he is the creator of all things, and he is the judge, and he is able to do as he pleases. But thankfully, he is never unjust, he's never capricious, and we must simply rest in that fact by faith. And a couple of verses, Pastor Carl shared this one. When you go to the book of James, and he refers back to the book of Job, he says, brothers, as an example of patience. Now that's a clear message of the book of Job. Job is given to us as an example of patience. And who knows that we need patience? If there's anybody here that has never had an issue with patience, I would like to meet you and talk to you. But we're told that as an example of patience in the face of suffering, and we've got brothers and sisters who are suffering for the cause of Christ all over the world and have throughout time. We're blessed in that we do relatively little suffering. But obviously, throughout history, it's estimated in the first 3 centuries, 6 million Christians were executed by the Roman government. And so, an example of patience in the face of suffering. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen that what the Lord finally brought about. And the good news is, in that story, what did God finally bring about? Well, 4 chapters of dialogue with Job. Job had been crying out, wanting an audience with God, and he got it. So that's good news. So even though he had to wait a long time to get it, he did have his day where God came to him, and that itself was greatly comforting to him. So God did come. And then as you look beyond in that story to the final chapter in Job, we see that God again blessed him physically with a new family. He blessed his finances so that they were doubled. And Job once again was highly respected. So God's intent was not just to create trouble. God's intent was to bring Job from one place to another place. And Job, of course, did declare, before I learned about you or knew of you from the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have beheld you. So clearly, Job had a far deeper understanding and knowledge and appreciation of God, having gone through the trial. And this last statement here is, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. We should never lose sight of that. Despite the troubles, he is compassionate and he is merciful. And then one more verse here. Get this. Hebrews, God has said, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. So no matter what troubles you experience, you can rest in this. I mean, we've all had things where we felt, hurt, maybe even felt abandoned or lonely, but we have the assurance of God's word. He says he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. We can rest in that. We can quote that if we need to. If you're feeling down, if you're feeling abandoned, if you're feeling lonely, go to Hebrews 13:5. God has said, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Jesus said, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. So we have far more to work on than Job had. And we have his book, but we have all the other scriptures too. Okay, so that's where that is. And for those who are curious about learning more about these things, these are some websites that I find very helpful. Genesis Apologetics, actually part of this presentation I received from the president. I had reached out to him because I liked some of his material, and he said, here you go. And Creation Ministries International, they have over 14,000 articles. So they have a search engine. You can simply type in Behemoth, Leviathan, or anything else that's of interest to you. And chances are you'll hit on multiple articles on that topic, Big Bang, dinosaurs, whatever. You put in and you will find a number of articles that you'll find very helpful. And then these others, many of you know Answers in Genesis, Institute of Creation Research, which was the first one that I knew about back in the 1970s. And then Northwest Creation Research Network has less than others, but they have a lot of good lectures. We're going to wrap up now, and if afterwards you have any questions about what you've seen, I'll hang out up front, and you're welcome to come give your questions, okay? Thank you.
Let's stand together and worship.